Last time, we watched the world go to war. Empires mobilized, armies marched, and the guns opened up across Europe. But the Great War of Movement, the war generals had planned for, died within months. By the winter of 1914, soldiers on both sides had reached for their shovels. And the world they dug themselves into was unlike anything in the history of human conflict. This is the story of life underground, of the men, most of them teenagers, who lived, fought, and died in a strip of churned earth stretching over 700 kilometres from the Swiss border to the North Sea. This is life in the trenches, building a trench system. A trench was not just a ditch, it was a city buried in the earth. The front line trench, the one closest to the enemy, was rarely a straight line. It was deliberately built in a zigzag pattern called a traverse, so that if a shell or an enemy soldier broke in, the blast or the gunfire couldn't travel the full length of the trench and kill everyone inside. Behind the front line ran a second support trench, and behind that a reserve trench. These were connected by a web of communication trenches used to move men, supplies, and the wounded. The whole system could extend back 2 miles or more, and on the other side of no man's land, the Germans were doing exactly the same thing. Except the Germans went deeper, reinforcing their positions with concrete bunkers that could survive artillery bombardment. The walls of a trench were held up with sandbags, wooden planks, and corrugated iron. The floor was lined with wooden slats called duckboards, though these were rarely enough to keep the water out. At the top of the front wall, the parapet, ran a fire step, a ledge where soldiers could stand to fire or observe the enemy. So what was it actually like to live there? A soldier's day on the Western Front was built around one principle. You did not move in daylight. The enemy was watching. Snipers were patient. So the rhythm of trench life ran on darkness. Each day began with stand to, the order to man the parapet at dawn and dusk, the 2 moments most likely for an enemy attack. Every soldier fixed their bayonet, stood on the fire step, and stared out into no man's land for up to an hour. Nothing usually happened, but you stood there anyway. After stand down came breakfast, if it arrived. Then the long business of the day, maintaining the trench, filling sandbags, repairing duckboards, cleaning rifles, killing rats. At night, the trench came alive. Patrols crept into no man's land to gather intelligence or cut enemy wire. Carrying parties moved supplies up from the rear. Working parties repaired damage from the day's shelling. Sleep happened in shifts, 2 hours here, 3 hours there, in dugouts carved into the walls of the trench. Food was a central obsession. British soldiers were supposed to receive around 4,000 calories a day. A tough target when hot food had to travel miles from field kitchens in containers called Dixies, often arriving cold and unrecognisable. The staples were tinned bully beef, hard biscuits, bread, and a sweet paste called macaroni, a stew of vegetables and meat that soldiers hated but ate anyway. Tea was sacred. A mug of hot, heavily sweetened tea was often the best moment of the day. Rum was issued at stand to, a small measure, officially for warmth and morale, though many men would say it was the only thing that made the next hour bearable. In the line for longer stretches, the diet became monotonous and nutritionally poor. Vitamin deficiencies were common, so were stomach complaints, and when supply lines were disrupted by bombardment, men went hungry entirely. The horrors, rats, mud, disease. But the real enemy of daily life was not always the man in the opposite trench. It was the trench itself, the rats. They were everywhere, enormous, emboldened, and impossible to eliminate. They fed on the food stores, the rubbish, and soldiers wrote home about this. The bodies of the dead lying in no man's land. Men woke to find them running across their faces. They were killed in their dozens, but for every rat that died, 10 more appeared. Then there were the lice. Every soldier had them. They nested in the seams of uniforms and could not be permanently removed. Men spent hours running candle flames along the seams of their shirts, a practice called chatting, finding a brief hour's relief before the cycle began
Lice caused a miserable condition known as trench fever, which sent thousands of men to hospital. And then there was the mud, particularly in Flanders, where the water table sits just below the surface and the clay soil holds every drop of rain. The mud became a feature of the landscape. At Passchendaele in 1917, which we'll cover in a future episode, men drowned in shell craters. Horses disappeared. The mud was not just inconvenient, it was lethal. Standing in waterlogged trenches for days on end caused a horrific condition called trench foot. The tissue of the feet would begin to rot. In the first winter of the war, cases ran into the tens of thousands. Soldiers were eventually ordered to rub whale oil into their feet and change their socks regularly. Officers were held responsible if their men developed the condition. For all the mundane misery of daily trench life, the act that soldiers feared most was the one they were there to do: go over the top. An attack began with an artillery bombardment, sometimes lasting days, intended to destroy the enemy's wire and suppress their defenses. Then at 0 hour, whistles blew along the line, and men climbed up over the parapet and walked, sometimes they were ordered to walk, into no man's land. The space between the trenches varied from as little as 30 meters to over a kilometer. It was cratered, wired, and covered by machine guns that could fire 400 to 600 rounds per minute. The mathematics were brutal. At the Somme, on July 1st, 1916, the bloodiest single day in British military history, nearly 57,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded in a single day. Many of them were cut down in the first minutes after 0 hour. Generals on both sides understood that frontal assault was costly. What they struggled to find was an alternative. The trench lines extended so far in each direction that flanking was almost impossible. The answer, they kept concluding, was more men, more shells, more sacrifice. The logic of attrition, wearing the enemy down until they broke, became the defining strategy of the war. One of the war's most profound and least understood casualties was invisible. The relentless noise of artillery, a sound so powerful it could rupture eardrums from a distance, vibrate organs, crack the mind, broke thousands of soldiers in ways no wound could explain. Doctors called it shell shock. Men trembled uncontrollably. They went mute. They relived attacks over and over in waking nightmares. They couldn't stop weeping. They couldn't function. The military establishment, at first, refused to believe it was a medical condition. Shell shock was widely seen as cowardice. Some men were court-martialed. Some were shot. But the scale became impossible to ignore. By the end of the war, the British Army alone had recorded over 80,000 cases. Army psychiatrists, a profession that barely existed before 1914, began developing the first systematic treatments for what we would today call post-traumatic stress disorder. The trenches didn't just reshape the physical landscape of Europe. They changed our understanding of the human mind. And yet, through all of it, the men wrote. Letters home poured out of the trenches in extraordinary volume. The British Army alone handled over 2 billion letters and parcels during the war. Writing was a lifeline, a connection to a world that still existed somewhere beyond the wire. What they wrote was often carefully self-censored. They knew the letters would be read by officers. But between the lines, and sometimes right on them, you can feel the exhaustion, the longing, and remarkably, the dark humor that became a defining feature of trench culture. Men made jokes about the mud, about the food, about the rats. It was a way of staying human. The trenches were not just a military strategy. They were a world with its own language, its own routines, its own culture, born from the specific misery of that narrow strip of earth. The men who survived them never fully left. The trenches followed them home in nightmares, in silence, in the way they flinched at a car backfiring 20 years later. Next time, we'll look at one of the most catastrophic single engagements of that world, the Battle of the Somme. How it started, what happened on that first morning, and what it revealed about the nature of industrial warfare. Until then, thank you for watching Notes from the Past. If this episode found you, leave a comment below. These stories deserve to be heard.